Matthew chapter 6 is where we'll be this evening. Matthew chapter 6. Who is George Santos? I'm not even sure he knows who he is. A little over a year ago, he was running for a congressional seat within New York City. And to try to woo and impress people, he claimed to be a gay Jewish man who had received a sizable inheritance from an extended family member. On top of that, he also claimed to be somewhat of a wonder boy that was an insider with Citigroup. And people were getting impressed, especially those around New York City, to the point where they actually voted him into office last November. He won the election. He's a member of Congress. But there were some questions being asked, and people started scratching their head. And they started doing some digging, even some major media outlets and newspapers. And even the New York Times got involved, the Washington Post. And as they did further digging, yes, he was indeed gay, married to another man, but he wasn't Jewish, even though he claimed to be Jewish. He had never received a sizable inheritance. In fact, it was amazing to them how he had been able to sustain himself economically because he didn't even really work a regular job. And on top of that, he had no connection to Citigroup. He didn't have any investment skills whatsoever. In other words, what the people of New York got in electing him into the office for Congress was, yes, a congressman, but they also received a liar who you can't even trust. And even as in preparation for this, I was curious, have they gotten rid of him? No, but there's all kinds of charges being brought against George Santos because George Santos struggles with even who he is and nailing down his own qualities. Now, have you ever met somebody like that they promise big, but then they underdeliver? It's easy to do that because we want people to like us, don't we? We want to woo people in about who we are, what we can accomplish. We want them to be riveted to our words. But follow-through is a different story. Well, Jesus talks about that in Matthew chapter 5. This is the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is talking primarily to his disciples. And if you go back to chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, you find that his disciples came unto him. The crowd is kind of eavesdropping from the background. Disciples stand up to listen, and then Jesus sat down. I like that as a preacher. So Jesus sat down. They're standing up, kind of going down the mountainside. So he's sitting up on a higher place on the mountain. They're standing down low. And it's just beautiful acoustics right there along the Sea of Galilee. And he teaches them many amazing things, the Beatitudes. He talks about their righteousness needing to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. And then he gets into, you have heard that it was said by them of old time. And there is a quote from not the Old Testament per se, but what the scribes had interpreted down through the centuries to where Jesus was then. And we come to that again here in chapter 5, verse 33. Notice what the scriptures say in chapter 5 of Matthew, verse 33. Again, ye have heard that it hath been said by them of old time, thou shalt not forswear thyself, but shalt perform unto the Lord thine oaths. But I say unto you, swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, neither by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Neither shalt thou swear by thy head, because thou canst not make one hair white or black, but let your communication be yea, yea, nay, nay. For whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. And all God's people said, Amen, or yea. Yes, this is the truth. One aspect that we're serious about at Hillview Baptist Church is seeing faithful people raised up. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. And the things which thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to, can you talk to me? You know the next phrase, to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also. That word faithful is the Greek word pistos, which has the idea of reliable, dependable. It implies honest men. What they speak is what you get in their life. There's no duplicity between the two. They're authentic, they're genuine, and of course it would apply to women as well. If we are focusing on spiritual leadership, a vital component of spiritual leadership is simply to be faithful, reliable people. What you see is what you get. There's no disconnect between the verbal and the real life. It's congruent all across. And as we look at Matthew chapter 5, Jesus undergirds us with his own disciples. Now you think about it. He's wanting to prepare his disciples to turn the world upside down. He wants them to be faithful men. So what is he going to do? He goes back to the Old Testament and says, now let me tell you what the Old Testament says, or more of what the Old Testament scribes have interpreted from the Old Testament law, the Torah namely. And he begins by saying in verse 33, hey, everyone knows that perjury is wrong. Everybody gets that. That's a no-brainer. It's not an epiphany when your scribes get up and say, and he quotes them here, thou shalt not forswear, that means to commit perjury, to take a false oath, but shalt perform unto the Lord thine oaths. Duh. We know that. But why was this such a big deal? Well, it's interesting that he quoted Leviticus chapter 19, verse 12 in the first part of the verse where it says, thou shalt not forswear thyself. That's a direct quote from the Torah. But it says in the latter part of the verse, this is more scribal commentary. It does not say this word for word in Leviticus. It is more their interpretation when they say that thou shalt perform unto the Lord thine oaths. Now, is that true? Absolutely. But I just want to emphasize this, that through their traditions, they had added to God's law through the interpretation and the commentary from the scribes, trying to help God's people understand what it's saying. And so Jesus is referring to what everybody had heard since they were in just their primary school in Judaism. They'd heard this. The scribes always talked about this. So what did they mean by this? It meant, don't stand up in a court, raise your hand, or make an oath, or adjure God, saying, by God, I will do this, and then not do it. Yeah, we get it, Jesus. That's what my mama taught me. My rabbi taught me that. Yeah, we hear that in the synagogue. We know what you mean. But I must say that this is reflecting the heart of God. Even though this was not necessarily inspired, passed down through the ages, it's still reflecting the heart of God. God wants his people to fulfill their oaths, doesn't he? Like if people say, I promise I'm going to do this, or by God, God is my witness, I'm going to do this. Yeah, they better follow through on this. So there's no error in what the scribes are saying. It reminds us that there is a tendency in the human heart to veer off the truth and to be dishonest. For example, when you post something on Marketplace and somebody messages you saying, yes, I'll be there at 1:30 to pick it up, what are the chances they're going to be there at 1:30 to pick it up? Help me out for a moment. Maybe 50% chance? You've dealt with flaky Marketplace shoppers like I have? People don't keep their word, do they? Or it could be when you close on that house or that refinance, you don't sign 2 documents and you're done. You almost get carpal tunnel from signing so many times, hundreds of signatures. Why? Because they want to make sure you keep your word. And they're going to make sure they get everything documented, they keep that on file, and then they come after you if you default on any payments because trust is an issue in our society. Or when a political candidate stands up and there's a debate going on and they say, now, if I am elected to the Senate or if I am elected President of the United States, we're going to hear a lot of this a year from now, aren't we? And all these promises, what are you thinking? I mean, are you thinking, yeah, they're really going to do this? No, you're asking, okay, how much of this is smoke? Why? Because they got a track record. Trust is low in our society. And by the way, you think it's bad in America, go to a third world country where there's bribery going on and you pay off the police and there's all kinds of corrupt, you just go across the border into Mexico and according to our missionary Ryan Case, man, it's bad. Trust is digressing everywhere. That's part of the human condition. So if everyone knows that perjury is wrong, verse 33, then what's the issue? What's the big deal? We know that, Jesus. Well, Jesus knew a subtle dishonesty that had slipped into Jewish culture and still slips into our society today and in our hearts, and he is going to not just subtly come in the back door, he's going to take this head on. Now notice what he says. He basically says in verses 34 through 36, Jesus prohibited any kind of swearing, any kind of swearing, any kind of oath. Now, he's not talking about in a court of law where you put your hand on the Bible or raise your right hand and you take an oath. He's not talking about that per se. We'll get to that here in just a moment. In this day, this is what he's referring to. Verse 34. But I say unto you, swear not at all. Now, what's the big deal about not swearing at all? Well, he gives an idea on how they were swearing. Neither by heaven, for it is God's throne. So we can look at this by implication, just in the biblical text, that they would say, by heaven, I am going to pay you by the end of the day, or before the next Sabbath. By heaven is my witness. So what's the big deal about this? Well, if you look at some extra biblical information here and do some historical study, what was going on in this day is they had taken that statement from the scribes and said, perform unto the Lord thine oaths as long as God is the witness. If God's name is invoked, you better follow through on it. But if God's name isn't invoked, there's this little caveat, this little loophole that I can get out of it because God's name wasn't invoked. And so they became very crafty at this. And that's what Jesus is picking away at here. I shouldn't say picking away. He's taking on head on here. What he is saying is, you say you're invoking heaven, but hey, do you realize you're mentioning God because that's God's throne? You didn't say the name of God, but you referred to God. Verse 35, it says, nor by the earth. Well, I promise you by the earth. Not heaven, because that's God's throne, but by the earth. Hey. You just mentioned God because that's his footstool. Still reference to God. Goes on and says in verse 35, neither by Jerusalem. Well, I won't do heaven, I won't do earth, I'll do Jerusalem. Well, that's the city of the great king. That's where God dwells. That's where he came down for the temple when Solomon built it. You're still referring to God. And then in verse 36, maybe, I'll just swear by my head because that's not anything religious, right? Even though some of us have a little less hair than others. And it says in verse 36, because thou canst not make one hair white or black. In other words, you're still making reference to God who knows the very number of your hairs. You know what his point is? Whether you mention the name of God in your promises or not, God is always in it and he's always watching. He's involved. You can't dodge that reality. Jesus is saying you cannot avoid God's name. Now, this is so in two ways. First of all, God is witness to everything. He sees what's going on. Some of you, last Sunday evening, you went knocking doors. And you saw the sign on the front of the house. You're on camera. And sure enough, you look up in the corner right above the door, and sure enough, it's looking right at you. Okay? Surveillance is going on. I'm not doing anything sketchy or shady here. I'm just going to knock on the door, leave a track, and be on my way. We're good. But do you realize that God's camera is always on you in what you say, what you commit to? God is always witness. You cannot avoid that. So that's one aspect here. But another aspect is, not only is God your witness, but you take the name of God with you, because if you name the name of Christ, you represent Him. Have you ever gone shopping somewhere and you're talking to a rep, a salesperson on the floor, and they gripe about their job, something they don't like about it? They're complaining. What impression does that give you of the company? It doesn't help your impression. Whether they like working there or not, they're representing that company. And if they're doing sketchy business with you or having a bad attitude, that reflects back on the company they represent. How much more if we as believers, wearing the name of God, saying, I'm a follower of Jesus, I'm a Christian, I'm a believer, I've been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, and we give our word to something and then don't follow through, we're representing our God because His name is attached to us. So the point that I want you to see, Jesus prohibited any kind of swearing for two reasons. Number one, because God is always watching. Secondly, because you wear God's name. You can't get away from that. So everyone knows that perjury is wrong. Jesus prohibited any kind of swearing, which brings me to a question. So if we can't swear, how do you hook people in to get them to take you seriously? Like, I really want them to pay attention to what I'm going to say. I want them to know that I'm really serious about this. Well, let's talk about it on the front end, okay? We're not even talking about what we do later. On the front end, you don't have to say, I pinky promise I'm going to do this. Oh, God is my witness, I'm going to follow through. I promise you this time. I vow before God, we don't need to say any of that. A good way, according to James chapter 4, is just simply to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. Here's a great statement here in making your plans. God willing, I'm going to be there. With everything in me, I'm going to do this. And if something comes up, I'm going to communicate and let you know. I mean, even we can dodge that a little bit sometimes by even using the word, I intend to be there. You know, it's my desire to be there. And so on the front end, we're still showing our seriousness, and we're also showing that we're taking our word seriously. We're not just rashly flinging vows and promises all over the place. So Jesus prohibited swearing of any kind. The way to hook people in is not necessarily to say, I promise, or I vow before God, or God is my witness, but rather just to say, God willing, it's in my heart to do this. Do my best to make that happen. Now, you know what it's like. You don't ever say, I'll try to do it. What does that mean when somebody says, I'll try? That's almost like the biggest loophole out of it, like they're not even going to do it. There's like a 10% chance they're going to do it if they say, I'll try to do it. No, they really don't want to do it. And so I don't encourage you to use the statement, I'll try to do that. But we got to zoom out and ask, are we wanting people to be impressed with us on the front end, or are we wanting people to trust us in the long run? Which do you prefer? You want them to be impressed with your claims like George Santos tried to impress everybody? Hey, I will do this, I promise, I vow before God I'm going to do this. Or would you rather, over time, for them to say, oh man, he said he's going to do it, even with the God willing in front of it, or I plan on doing that. He takes it seriously. This sister, this brother always follows through or communicates on what they're going to do, what the plan is. So how do you combat this tendency, this tension between, I want people to like me on the front end, I want them to listen to what I'm saying, at the same time I want them to trust me long term. I think Jesus gives that connection in verse 37, in which he says, but let your communication be yea, yea, and nay, nay. The word communication is that largely used word throughout the Greek New Testament, logos, which means communicating some kind of idea. Like I'm communicating this concept. It might be a promise. It might just be a statement about yourself. It might be just a claim about life. But make sure that the information, the logos that you're sharing is credible. And that people would listen to that, and particularly let your yes end up being yes, and your no end up being no. It's simple honesty. You speak and then your actions follow what you speak. It's that simple. Let me put it another way. Your mouth is connected to your feet and your hands. They aren't separate on a separate body here. They're all in conjunction. Your yea is yea, your nay is nay. James chapter 5, verse 12 puts it this way. Moreover, chapter 5, verse 12. Above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by the earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea, and your nay, nay, lest ye fall into condemnation. This is James, the brother of Jesus, who probably heard Jesus teach this. And he's saying, yeah, Jesus is right. Let your yea be yea, and your nay, nay. But then the latter part of the verse gives the condition of what happens if that's not the case. If your yea is nay, or your nay becomes yea, what happens? Look at verse 37. For whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. Now, the Greek implies that it's not just like an evil event. It could be referring to a person, not necessarily just a thing, a happening. And so it could be saying verse 37, lest you fall into the trap of the evil one. So how can we fall into the trap of the evil one? Or how can we fall into evil coming upon us? Well, Proverbs chapter 10, verse 19 says, in the multitude of words there wanteth not sin, but he that refraineth his lips is wise. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 19. You say, why do you mention Proverbs chapter 10, verse 19? Because the more you have to put into this statement to get people to believe you, the more you're opening yourself up for a fall and for sin. You've been around people like that. And it almost gets to the point where people say, I promise, I really promise this time, I'm really going to do it. I'm like, well, you're digging a hole here. You're digging a hole. Why do you have to amp up the promise so much? And Jesus is describing that phenomenon right here. That if we have to talk and sell people constantly to believe us, that's probably saying something about ourselves. And the evil one has gotten in there to undermine our credibility and our trust with others. It's kind of like this. You go to YouTube, you see that title on the YouTube video, you click on it, it's a dud. It's called clickbait. Overpromise and undeliver. I mean, that's the way to be successful on YouTube, they say, huh? Not really. But clickbait's all over the place. Hey, I don't want to be a clickbait Christian, do you? We can be clickbait believers. Just always having this catchy title. But man, the content, oh man, that's kind of bland. That's kind of dull. So what's the point that we ought to get out of this? And then I want to work out some personal application here in just a moment. Everyone knows that perjury is wrong. Jesus prohibited any kind of swearing. Jesus esteemed simple honesty in verse 37. Here's what I want you to get this evening. As a spiritual leader, and remember, last week, all of us in the name of Christ ought to see ourselves as influencers. We are spiritual leaders in some dynamic. As a spiritual leader, follow through on your word because of God's presence. You bear the name of God, and God is always watching you. Therefore, make sure that the follow-through is there. Now, what does that mean for us specifically? Therefore, here's 3 practical points on this. Therefore, think before you commit. Think before you commit. Now, here's the reality. Between what I say I'm going to do, between my claim here, is a huge gap before the follow-through called circumstances changing, my emotions changing, obstacles getting in the way. I have a better option or a better route that comes up. There's this big gap between what I say and what I do. And therefore, before we jump and claim to do something or our intention to do something, we got to at least consider that gap. Because we've all lived that gap, haven't we? As you think about it, if it's a big commitment, it's a good idea to pray. That's part of thinking through it. It's a good idea to look at your calendar, make sure there's no conflicts. How many of you would say, yeah, on my mental calendar, yeah, that's wide open, that's wide open. Yeah, I think we're in for that. And you go back and look at your calendar, oh, I forgot about that commitment. Boy, eat humble pie. I've done that before. No, check the calendar. Look and see what's going on before you commit to this. Now this can be, at ground level, something as simple as you've been busy. Life is crazy. And your kid comes up to you just saying, hey, Dad, can we go on a bike ride? Well, yeah, you want to go. You want to go. And you haven't gone on a bike ride in like 2 or 3 weeks with your kid, and it's been beautiful weather, unlike today. And you want to commit, but rather than saying, I promise, by the end of this week, I'm going to do this, you think and you say, okay, I got to look at my calendar. I probably ought to just carve out my time, mark it on the calendar if need be, if it's that crazy. Bike ride with Bobby. Bike ride with my girl. I'm going to make this happen. I'm going to close up this gap so the variables are minimal between my claim. Yeah, I want to go on a bike ride right now. Yeah, I'll go on by the end of this week. Close up that gap by locking this in and say, okay, I'm going to analyze before I commit to this with my kid. Here's another one. And I already plead guilty to this one, okay? See if you're with me on this. A sister unloads about a struggle. I'll pray for you, sister. I'll pray for you. Do you really go back into your prayer closet and pray for that sister? Pray for that brother. And if you take it seriously, amen, my hat's off to you. But isn't it easy just to, that's like the cordial thing to say, I'll pray for you. Like that's almost insulting not to say that. Like they don't care if they don't say I'm praying for you, especially in a church family, because we're supposed to be spiritual. But even something like that, I'll pray for you. Often what I've done is, if it's a text message, I know I'm going to forget to do it later. I stop what I'm doing if I'm in the place to do it, and I pray right then. I'm praying for you right now that God would work and show himself powerful. I mean, this is prayer to God. You talk about God's presence and God's name being on that. Yeah, if we say we're going to pray, we better pray. So think before you commit. But then secondly, externalize your commitments. Externalize your commitments. Now, let me define commitment. When you give a yay, when you say, yes, I'll take care of this, or yes, that's my intention, or yes, that's my plan, can you keep them all straight in your brain? If you can, you're gifted, because I'm not. We have to have something outside of our brain that's so limited to keep our word straight. How many of you have overloaded your RAM at times? And it might be 32 gigabytes up in that brain, but you got 64 gigabytes of information you got to try to keep straight. It's rough. We got to offload some of that. You say, what do you mean by that specifically? Well, going back to the calendar idea. It could be something as simple as reminders on your iPhone. It could be some other app that Brother Dan connects with you on an Android phone. I'm illiterate when it comes to that. Brother Dan knows about that type stuff. But some kind of app that is helpful to keep things straight, where you externalize, you get it off your own RAM. You can't keep all of it straight. Externalize it somewhere. Now, how many of you, I'm just curious, how many of you feel like you got a good system? You have a good system as far as externalizing commitments. Just raise your hand for a moment. You feel like you got a good system of externalizing commitments. Okay, about half of us, maybe a little over half of us. That's good, that's good. Let me give you a couple pointers in making the most of externalizing those commitments. So your yay can be yay and your nay can be nay. First of all, you have to have the same headquarters. I mean, this is the same place where all these commitments are going. Whether it's a calendar, whether it's a phone, whether it's some kind of app, or whether it's the top drawer of your desk. There has to be the same headquarters. But then secondly, there has to be a rhythm where you check that daily. Every day you got to be looking at headquarters to make sure you're not missing anything, if not multiple times a day. And having a rhythm where you're looking at this headquarters to say, okay, am I missing anything today? What's going on? What do I need to complete? What did I commit to today? And so a headquarters and a rhythm of looking at that will allow you to have your yay be yay and your nay nay. Make sense? Simple enough? Now, it's not easy all the time, but having those two help you externalize your commitments. And then number 3, always remember that God is watching and listening. Always remember that God is watching and listening. At the end of the day, He is your witness. What He hears is the only thing that counts. It doesn't matter how much that brother was impressed with what you claim. It doesn't matter how happy your kid was that you said you go on a bike ride with them. It doesn't matter how much that sister was soothed by you saying, I will pray for you. God was watching. And by keeping in mind that God is watching and listening to our words, keeps us accountable to make sure our yea is yea and our nay is nay. Now, right here, getting this idea of follow through entrenched in our hearts and our souls in the long run builds your personal trust with others. It builds your credibility with others. When you speak, people take you seriously. And when we come together as a church family and we have individuals that are this way, and we say, yes, I'll look into that. Yes, I'm going to take action in this area. It builds trust with the church family. It's a beautiful thing when you have a high trust church family that has follow through on what they say. May God continue to deepen a church family like this. By the way, I'm thankful I'm not killing weeds tonight primarily. I saw how many raised your hand. I thank God for the dependable follow-through of so many of you. But at the same time, some of you are new to Hillview Baptist Church, and maybe you're new in the faith, and you're just kind of learning this idea of the Christian faith. Hey, we want to invite you into spiritual leadership as well by just having simple follow-through. And that's a vital component of being an influencer for the Lord Jesus Christ. Let's go and stand with heads bowed and eyes closed as we conclude our time together this evening.